The billionaire had everything until a maid taught him how to see his son. Maxwell Harrington, CEO of Harrington Industries, lived in a world built on numbers, power, and control. Every decision was calculated, every relationship transactional. His mansion gleamed with perfection, yet behind its walls, Maxwell felt a hollow absence. His son, Ethan, 9, was different. Diagnosed with autism, Ethan rarely spoke and often retreated into his own world. Maxwell's attempts to connect, expensive toys, structured lessons, even therapists had failed. One rainy afternoon, as Maxwell approached cautiously, the polished floors of the living room reflecting his own uncertainty more than anything else. He had anticipated chaos, disorder, tantrums, or at least some trace of defiance that would justify the concern he had felt during the last few months. Instead, he found a calmness he could not reconcile with his expectations. Mariah sat cross-legged on the rug, her hands gently cupping Ethan's small fingers, as if every movement was a fragile note in a symphony only she could hear. Maxwell paused, unsure whether to step forward or retreat, afraid that even the slightest misstep might disrupt the fragile equilibrium he saw. The room smelled faintly of vanilla and old books, a scent that somehow made Maxwell feel both out of place and yearning to belong. He noticed the way Ethan's eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned everything with a quiet intensity, noting the subtle shifts of light, the shadows that flickered across the corners of the room, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Maxwell had never seen his son like this, had never imagined a child could observe the world so deeply, with such a raw, unfiltered attention. It made him uncomfortable, almost guilty, as though all the hours spent away in boardrooms and flights had built a barrier between them, one that money, influence, or even the most carefully chosen gifts could never breach. Mariah, noticing his hesitation, smiled softly, a mixture of reassurance and understanding. "He's listening to the world in a way we don't see," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet carrying a weight that cut through the layers of Maxwell's ego. Her eyes, steady and compassionate, met his, silently challenging him to look beyond the superficial, to see the depth that he had overlooked. Ethan, sensing the presence of someone else, reached slowly for a small, intricately carved wooden toy, a gift Mariah had placed before him earlier in the day. With a deliberate gentleness, he pressed it into Mariah's waiting hand, as though acknowledging her patience, her attention, and her understanding. Maxwell's chest tightened. He realized with a jolt that this tiny, deliberate act held more meaning than any conversation he had ever had with his son, more meaning than any deal he had closed or presentation he had commanded. It was an unspoken exchange, a dialogue of trust and recognition that he had failed to notice for years. He remembered the countless times he had tried to teach Ethan things he thought were important, how to count money, how to identify influential people, how to navigate a world that valued power above all else. None of those lessons had reached him. Instead, it was Mariah, with her quiet patience and gentle insistence, who had unlocked the door to Ethan's understanding. Maxwell realized something profoundly unsettling. He did not know his own child. The walls he had built around himself, the routines he had prioritized, and the relentless pursuit of achievement had blinded him to the human beneath. The laughter he had assumed he would hear from Ethan, the spontaneous joy he imagined in every child, had always been muted or absent in his perception, and he now understood that it was not because Ethan lacked it, but because he had failed to witness it. The moments stretched on, and Maxwell felt the weight of years pressing down upon him. He wanted to reach for his son, to bridge the gap, but the words caught in his throat, inadequate and hollow compared to the silent language unfolding before him. He watched Ethan tilt his head slightly, the corners of his lips twitching in what Maxwell assumed was a private amusement, a tiny secret only the child understood. The realization struck him with a force that was almost physical. He had missed the world that existed within Ethan, a world untouched by accolades, untouched by wealth, untouched by the expectations that had consumed. Days turned into weeks, but in that time, Maxwell felt as if he had been transporting into a different reality, one he had never bothered to notice before. He no longer measured hours by meetings or calls, nor counted value in contracts signed or stock prices moved. Instead, he observed the small universe Mariah and Ethan had quietly constructed around themselves. At first, he sat on the edges of the room, stiff and unsure, hesitant to step in, afraid that even a single misstep could shatter the fragile balance. He watched Ethan's movements, noting the precision of his gestures, the careful deliberation in how he handled toys, the way his eyes flicked toward Mariah as if she were a lighthouse guiding him through an otherwise incomprehensible world. Maxwell began to see patterns, subtle codes in their interactions, the tilt of a head, the flicker of a finger, a brief hum or murmur that seemed meaningless to any outsider. But Mariah responded to each with a patience and attentiveness that Maxwell had never seen in any adult ever, and he realized it was more than observation. It was a dialogue, a language built from trust and empathy, a communication that transcended conventional speech. Maxwell started keeping quiet, letting them lead, letting them set the pace. It was torture at first. Years of being in control, of always directing, of always knowing, clashed violently with the humility of simply watching. But slowly, he began to understand that this was not weakness, this was mastery of a different kind. He saw Ethan smile, a small, secretive curl of the lips that Maxwell would have missed if he had blinked, and felt an ache deep in his chest. He recognized that joy was not always loud or boisterous. Sometimes it was quiet, hidden, and only visible to those willing to pay attention. He noticed Mariah's subtle strategies, how she mirrored Ethan's movements to build trust, how she waited for him to initiate touch or interaction, how she celebrated each small achievement as if it were a victory over the universe itself. Maxwell realized that she had taught him something he had never learned in business, in school, or in life, that connection, not control, is the truest measure of influence. One evening, the breakthrough came in the simplest form imaginable. Ethan, who had never spoken more than a few fragmented words, looked at a small rubber ball lying on the rug. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for it, but instead of handing it to Mariah silently, he lifted his head, fixed his gaze on her, and said, "Ball." The sound was raw, unpolished, almost fragile, yet it carried a weight that Maxwell had never anticipated. His chest tightened as if the sound had physically struck him. The word was monumental, not because it was complex, but because it was authentic, deliberate, and shared. For a moment, time seemed to pause. Maxwell watched Mariah's face light up with a quiet triumph, her eyes reflecting tears she did not bother to hide. She repeated the word softly, encouragingly, letting Ethan hear himself, letting him own it. Maxwell felt an overwhelming mix of awe, relief, and grief for the years he had missed, the moments he had neglected, the milestones he had never noticed. That night, as he lay in bed, Maxwell reflected on what he had witnessed. The word ball was not a miracle in itself, but it represented something far greater, the possibility of connection, the breakthrough that comes when patience meets understanding. He understood that Mariah's gift was not found in techniques or manuals or pre-written scripts. Her talent was in seeing the humanity in Ethan, the joy hidden in his quirks, and the brilliance within his silence. She had taught Maxwell that achievement is not always loud, and that success is not always measurable in profits, accolades, or status. Some victories exist quietly, in the subtle acknowledgement of another human being, in the gentle shaping of trust, in the creation of a world where someone feels seen and understood. Over the next several days, Maxwell observed the small signals Ethan and Mariah developed, a tilt of the head that meant yes, a hum that meant wait, a gentle touch that communicated love. He realized that this language was richer than any negotiation tactic he had ever mastered. He saw Ethan's imagination bloom in ways that textbooks could never predict. He built intricate stories with his toys, assigned voices to invisible characters, and explored emotions without fear of judgment. Maxwell felt a mixture of humility and wonder. For years, he had believed that knowledge was control, that teaching was about instruction and correction. But here, in the soft glow of a lamp and the quiet murmur of a child discovering himself, he saw that learning was about presence, attention, and respect for another's perspective. He began participating cautiously, offering a hand when Ethan initiated it, laughing at the small jokes the child created, and learning to follow rather than lead. Every day brought new lessons, some of which were as simple as noticing how Ethan's eyes lingered on a shadow, how he arranged objects symmetrically, or how he reacted to certain sounds with delight or discomfort. Each observation was a revelation, a tiny puzzle piece Maxwell had never bothered to collect before. Slowly, Maxwell began to see parallels in his own life. The walls he had built to protect himself from failure, the constant chase for recognition, the belief that influence and authority were the ultimate measures of worth. He realized that these barriers had isolated him not only from his son, but from a deeper understanding of himself. Ethan and Mariah had in effect shown him a new way to live, one in which patience, attentiveness, and empathy were not weaknesses but strengths, where progress was measured not by domination or accumulation, but by understanding and connection. He began to embrace the small, unremarkable moments with Ethan, the first time he successfully stacked blocks, the way he laughed at a puppet show Mariah orchestrated, the silent moments when the child simply observed and processed. Each was a milestone far more meaningful than any boardroom victory Maxwell had ever known. He noticed, too, the effect Mariah had on him personally. She moved with a calm decisiveness that was magnetic, her presence gentle yet unshakable. Maxwell had always believed power came from force, from persuasion, from control. Watching her, he understood that influence could also come from understanding, from patience, from the ability to see people, to truly see them, and honor their pace and perception. Maxwell reflected on the nature of barriers, both literal and metaphorical. He realized that the walls he had built around Ethan had been barriers of expectation, routine, and distraction. Mariah had shown him how to break them, not with force, not with lectures or directives, but with quiet persistence, empathy, and genuine attention. Every gesture she encouraged, every response she validated, slowly dismantled the invisible walls that had kept Maxwell from truly knowing his son. And as he observed Ethan speak more words, respond with more confidence, and explore his surroundings with curiosity and joy, Maxwell felt a profound transformation taking place within himself. The rigid structures of his mind, honed for efficiency and control, began to soften. He began to understand that connection was the true measure of success, and that influence without understanding was empty. One evening, as Ethan handed Mariah the ball again, his tiny voice clear and steady, Maxwell finally allowed himself to feel something he had long suppressed, awe at the miracle of everyday life, gratitude for the patience and insight of another human being, and a renewed commitment to break his own patterns of absence and neglect. He realized that life, in its richest form, was not about profit margins or performance metrics, but about the silent victories, the breakthroughs of attention, and the simple joy of being present. That night, Maxwell stayed awake far longer than necessary, replaying the words, gestures, and subtle signals he had witnessed. He thought about the barriers he had constructed in his own life, the rigid definitions of success he had clung to, and the possibilities that awaited if he could learn to follow rather than lead, to observe rather than dictate, to connect rather than control. He finally understood that this was the lesson Mariah had been teaching all along, that human beings, particularly children, thrive not under pressure, but under understanding, not under commands, but under patience, not under expectation, but under attention. And as he lay in the quiet darkness, listening for the faintest sound of Ethan's breathing, Maxwell felt the stirrings of a new purpose, one that extended beyond wealth, ambition, and recognition, into the uncharted territory of love, understanding, and presence. He realized that breaking barriers was not about tearing down walls with force, but about opening doors quietly, letting someone else step through at their own pace, and walking alongside them in a world that, until now, he had never truly seen. Maxwell had always believed that love meant control, that guidance was inseparable from instruction, and that protection required oversight. He had approached fatherhood as he approached business, with strategies, objectives, and measurable outcomes. Yet, as he stepped into the familiar yet strange quiet of the mansion that evening, he was confronted with a different truth, one that unsettled him more than any market crash, any betrayal, any failed deal. He had intended to guide, to direct Ethan's play, to ensure the child achieved the right way to stack blocks, to speak, to interact. But as he leaned over, preparing to correct a small misstep in Ethan's arrangement of wooden shapes, Mariah gently placed a hand on his arm, her touch firm but reassuring. "He needs space to be himself," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that pierced through years of habitual certainty. "You can love him, but don't try to fix him." The words strung, carrying a truth that struck deeper than any reprimand, any failure, or any confrontation Maxwell had ever endured. It was a truth that his power could not bend, his wealth could not purchase, his intellect could not negotiate. It unsettled him, and yet somewhere beneath the discomfort, it awakened a dormant understanding. Maxwell had believed that control was love, that direction was care, that correction was affection. But here before him was a demonstration of the opposite: presence without imposition, observation without interference, acceptance without judgment. He felt a pang of guilt for the countless moments he had overlooked, for the invisible barriers he had erected between himself and his own child, for the laughter he had never heard and the gestures he had never noticed. That night, he made a choice, small, deliberate, yet monumental in its implications. He began participating differently. He did not reach to rearrange the toys, he did not offer advice, he did not attempt to direct. Instead, he sat beside Ethan on the soft rug, letting the child's rhythm dictate their interaction. He listened, truly listened, to the faint sounds, the subtle hums, the tiny shifts of expression that conveyed meaning beyond words. For hours he watched, absorbed, and mirrored, discovering that even silence could be expressive, that absence of speech was not absence of thought, that observation could be as powerful as action. And then, slowly, something remarkable happened. Ethan, sensing Maxwell's presence without pressure, began to engage him in small ways, offering a toy, pointing to a favorite block, humming a tune. Maxwell responded not with correction, but with reflection, repeating the sound, matching the rhythm, letting the child see that he was noticed, that he was understood. The first time Ethan laughed in response to Maxwell's mimicry, Maxwell felt a warmth that no financial victory, no political triumph, no accumulation of wealth had ever produced. It was raw, unguarded, and entirely uncalculable. The mansion, once a palace of solitude and silent expectation, began to resonate differently. The heavy air of obligation lifted, replaced with light, warmth, and sound. Laughter echoed off the walls, not the shallow laughter of performance, but the deep, shared joy of understanding, the kind that does not demand anything in return. Maxwell noticed nuances he had never observed before: the way Ethan's eyes sparkled when he succeeded at a small task, the way his lips quivered in concentration, the way he tilted his head when forming new ideas, the faint, almost imperceptible hums he made when engaged in thought. Each gesture became a revelation, each smile a lesson, each interaction a bridge spanning years of absence. He marveled at Mariah's patience, at the gentle consistency with which she honored Ethan's pace, never rushing, never forcing, never demanding. Maxwell understood that her gift was not a set of skills or formulas. It was a profound understanding of humanity, a commitment to presence, and a belief in the inherent value of another person. Inspired by her example, Maxwell began to shed his old compulsions. He laughed with Ethan instead of instructing. He mirrored his expressions instead of correcting them. He followed his lead instead of dictating his actions. Slowly, he felt the rigid structures of his own mind loosening. Patterns of control, fear of mistakes, obsession with outcomes, all began to soften under the simple, transformative power of shared presence. Maxwell began to anticipate moments of joy rather than dictate them. He noticed how Ethan responded to music, how he traced shadows with his fingers, how he arranged toys in seemingly chaotic patterns that were in fact meaningful to him. He began to celebrate small victories that had once seemed insignificant, like the first successful stacking of blocks without frustration, the spontaneous utterance of a new word, or the quiet giggle at a silly sound. Each moment became monumental in its own right, a testament to the power of understanding over instruction. Nights that were once filled with spreadsheets, conference calls, and strategy sessions were now permeated with the quiet rhythms of family life. Maxwell began to relish the simple acts of presence, reading aloud with Ethan, listening to the cadence of his voice, sharing in his imaginative stories, following his gaze without judgment. Laughter became a teacher in its own right, breaking barriers Maxwell had assumed were permanent. He began to notice a profound transformation in himself. Where once he had felt urgency, impatience, and the relentless drive to control, he now discovered patience, curiosity, and reverence. He saw the value in letting go, in accepting imperfection, and in recognizing the inherent brilliance in another human being. The mansion, which had always felt like a fortress protecting him from the world, became a sanctuary of connection. Walls that had once reflected only his power now echoed with laughter, whispered discoveries, and shared secrets. Maxwell realized that these were the lessons he had never learned from wealth, authority, or influence. that love is not measured in power, that presence is not weakness, that true success is reflected not in accolades, but in understanding another person, and that the joy of shared moments can heal absences far deeper than any gift or provision ever could. Slowly, day by day, Maxwell internalized Mariah's teaching, to love without controlling, to guide without dominating, to celebrate without demanding. He began to see himself not as a figure of authority over Ethan, but as a companion, a witness, a participant in the unfolding brilliance of a child discovering the world. The laughter, once foreign, became a language of its own, rich, unspoken, and transformative. It taught him patience, humility, and the extraordinary power of presence. Maxwell understood finally that lessons were not always learned through instruction. They were learned through attention, empathy, and shared joy. That night, as he watched Ethan drift into sleep, a faint smile still lingering on his lips, Maxwell felt a profound peace he had never known. The mansion was no longer a palace of isolation. It was alive, resonating with warmth, understanding, and the quiet triumph of connection. He understood, in a way that transcended words, that the barriers he had built in his own life, in his relationships, and in his perception of love, could be dismantled not by force or strategy, but by laughter, presence, and the patient, steady rhythm of attention. And for the first time, Maxwell realized that he could not only love without controlling, but that in doing so, he could truly know, honor, and celebrate the human being who had always been waiting for him on the other side of silence. The lessons Maxwell learned at home began to transform him in the outside world. He approached business with empathy, understanding that leadership wasn't just about authority, it was about listening. Mariah's influence extended beyond the living room floor. Maxwell began mentoring his executives on compassion, patience, and seeing people as humans, not just employees, but the most profound change remained in Ethan. Maxwell learned to celebrate small victories, to honor uniqueness, and to find joy in moments money could never buy. Years later, Maxwell would look back and realize the gift Mariah gave him wasn't just teaching Ethan, it was teaching him. Ethan, now flourishing and confident, smiled easily and laughed freely. Maxwell, once a man of steel and spreadsheets, had discovered something far richer: empathy, connection, and unconditional love. Mariah never sought recognition. She simply smiled, watching the bond she had nurtured. She reminded Maxwell daily that sometimes the richest lessons come from the simplest hearts. The billionaire CEO had been changed forever, not by wealth, power, or prestige, but by the tender, quiet patience of a woman who dared to see a child's world through his own eyes.